Hello? Cool. I think we're going to get started here with Miss Emily. Oh, good. She's in time. Hi. My name is Van. I'm very happy to be speaking on behalf of the Portland Center for Public Humanities and Xhurch as well. Thanks to Matt for opening up his home and venue to all of us for this lovely presentation, and thanks to Michael, the director of the Portland Center for Public Humanities at PSU, for letting me indulge in these programs. So this is the second lecture in the Vision series. We had Maja Daru come up from LA a couple weeks ago for the first lecture, and there's going to be a third one on May 29th at PSU by Mariana Ritchie. She'll be lecturing a talk called Feather on the Breath of God. That's about Hildegard von Bingen. These lectures are basically a series that are meant to focus on creativity and spirituality and the crossroads of that. And Emily Pothast is a very wonderful artist that I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last few years. She's a fantastic musician, speaker, and overall person that I'm really glad to call a friend. So I'm pleased to invite her up here for her talk, How to Draw God from Direct Observation. Thank you.
Augustin Lesage was born in 1876 to a family of coal miners in the small city of Auchel in northern France. When he finished school, Lesage himself became a miner. Perhaps it was through some accident of genetics, perhaps it was occasioned by sensory deprivation during all the hours he spent in the coal mines. But one evening in 1911, when Lesage was 35 years old, he heard a voice speaking to him from the darkness. "Do not be afraid. We are very close to you. One day, you will be a painter." Having never experienced a hallucination before, Lesage did what perhaps any one of us would have done. He repressed the memory and kept the incident a secret from his wife and children. Fortunately for us, his inner voices were persistent. He eventually confided in a friend who brought him to his first spiritualist meeting. He started attending seances and house parties where he learned the art of automatic writing, training himself to become a conduit for the messages of spirits who wished to communicate through him. The spirits told him, "The voices you heard down in the mines were real, and they speak the truth. You will be a painter. Don't be afraid. Don't try to understand it. Just heed our advice, even though you will find it ridiculous at first. We are the ones tracing through your hand." The voices instructed Lesage on where to order art supplies and which colors and brushes to buy. When the canvas arrived, it measured 3 meters square. Lesage started to cut it into smaller pieces, but the voices stopped him. "Oh no, that's how big the painting is." Every night after Lesage came home from the mines, he spent the evening painting. Describing the process, he wrote, "Before I start to paint, I never have any idea as to what I will want to portray. I never have an overview of the entire work at any time during the execution. My guides tell me, do not try to understand what you're doing, and I surrender to their impulse. It's like working without working." In 1913, Lesage decided to quit his day job and support himself as a faith healer. He was apparently pretty good at it, but within a few months he was arrested by French authorities, who charged him with practicing medicine without a license. In 1914, he was acquitted, based partially on the testimony of his dozens of successful clients. Later that year, he was sent to war, where he was temporarily reduced to making drawings on postcards instead of working on large canvases. In 1916, Lesage returned home and resumed his work in the mines, as well as his painting. In 1923, he found a patron in Jean Meyer, editor of the Spiritualist Journal, who enabled him to quit working in the mines and devote himself to painting. Some scholars of Augustin Lesage's work have suggested that his inspired visions from the spirit world were the result of schizophrenia. However, fortunately for the artist, whatever psychological anomalies he was suffering from did not interfere too drastically with his family life or work, as he always found ways to support himself. These paintings that I'm showing are from between 1916 and 1930. They constitute Lesage's classic period, when the artist painted his most inspired works. The paintings resemble great cosmic facades filled with possible ports of entry or exit, and characterized by dramatic shifts in scale from the very giant to the tiny. The arrangement of multi-tiered geometric forms around a central axis prefigures psychedelic art, the rise of op art, even digital art. But perhaps their most salient feature is that rather than being composed as an entire image first and filled in with detail later, they grow like crystals, bit by bit, little by little, by building up thousands of tiny elements to create larger emergent forms. The shapes don't refer to anything in the real world outside the painting. Rather, they encode their own alternate reality. As simple as this concept sounds today, Lesage's technique is actually quite radical and would have been unheard of in the history of European painting only a few years earlier. Despite his isolation from the art world, up in the coal mining regions of northern France, his work is synchronously contemporary with the rise of abstraction among professionally trained artists in the cultural capitals of Europe. Wassily Kandinsky is often cited as the first European artist to create completely non-objective paintings. Kandinsky was born in Moscow, Russia in 1866 and had a career in law and economics before emigrating to Germany and enrolling to art school at the age of 30. Kandinsky's painting was heavily influenced by his own synesthesia, specifically the experience of hearing sounds associated with the perception of certain colors, and seeing strange shapes move across his field of vision in response to musical stimulus. Working on visual art for Kandinsky was a process of resolving his own personal inner sounds, selecting notes that reinforced each other in pleasing harmonies he called spiritual chords. Not surprisingly, he had an avid interest in music. Atonal pioneer Arnold Schoenberg, who also painted strange spiritual pictures, was a close friend and contemporary, and Kandinsky also fostered an interest in Alexander Scriabin, whom he believed was trying to achieve in music something similar to what Kandinsky was interested in achieving in painting. For Kandinsky, the perceptual experiences of synesthesia were real, at least as real as anything else in subjective experience. Richard Cytowic, a contemporary American neurologist and expert in the field of synesthesia, uses the analogy of a television screen for human perception to explain synesthesia. The consensus image is the image we see on the screen when watching television, the terminal stage of the broadcast. Someone able to intercept the transmission anywhere between the studio camera and the TV screen would be like a synesthete, sampling the transmission before it reached the screen fully elaborated. Presumably, their experience would be different from those of us viewing the broadcast at home. Cytowic's analogy suggests that the extra information perceived by synesthetes could be something that normal consciousness just filters out for most people, and that through some accident of biology, the synesthete is somehow aware of a broader perceptual spectrum, an example, perhaps, of nature revealing its laws through its exceptions. The sentiment echoes the writings of Aldous Huxley regarding his early experiences with mescaline and other psychedelics, which inspired him to describe the role of consciousness as a reducing valve that distills information from the senses into pictures that make cognitive sense for consciousness. When the doors of perception are cleansed, as it were, and we are treated for some fleeting moment to a slightly wider glimpse of the full spectrum of reality, we're aware of some aspects of the transmission as it exists independently of what is seen, to continue the analogy, by ordinary viewers at home. The idea of consciousness as a transmission and the hardware of the mind as a receiver, like a television, are a fascinating area of inquiry. In his book, I'm a Strange Loop, the mathematician and computer scientist Douglas Hofstadter elaborates on the idea he proposed in his classic, Gödel, Escher, Bach, that what we call consciousness is essentially an emergent property of mappings of the human mind looping back on themselves in a recursive, infinitely self-referential system. A feedback loop, achieved by pointing a camera at a transmission of the camera's own feed, is a fascinating analog for self-awareness. The array of shapes that arise from such experimentation reveal emergent patterns that are indicative of the physical properties of the camera and the organic, rapidly transforming nature of feedback. In the absence of sensory input, the images seen by the camera reveal the noise inherent in the medium of transmission. Visual art is always an ongoing investigation of the mechanisms of seeing, and at this stage it's useful to note that human beings have been making objects that may be categorized as art for as long as we've been human, but it's only in the past few hundred years that the concept of art as something that could even be possibly envisioned as distinct from a ritual context has emerged. Therefore, for nearly all of human history, the relationship between the investigation of the mechanisms of seeing and what could be classified as spiritual or religious activity have been one and the same. Not surprisingly, the history of religious image making is chock full of feedback loops, tracers, and meta-fractaling realities, and other formal aspects that appear to be related to psychedelic art or the artwork of schizophrenics and synesthetes, as soon as we know how to look for them. Some of the earliest human artworks are petroglyphs, which resemble the forms that German-American psychologist Heinrich Kluver dubbed form constants. Recurring patterns of lattices, tunnels, and spirals, with fractaling proportions characteristic of visual hallucinations that reveal, according to some modern neurologists, structural information about the inner workings of the visual cortex. The scope of this discussion, and maybe even the length of one human life, is far too small for me to give anything except an extremely cursory glimpse of artwork representing the vast religious histories of all the diverse people populating our planet. But the tradition of artwork incorporating forms with striking similarities to visual hallucinations and Kluver's form constants is something that seems so inextricably woven with the human experience that we find examples at all times in history in virtually all places. Some of the most striking examples come from the realm of Hindu and Buddhist art. Both religions, where the mystical, meditative aspects of practice have traditionally been emphasized and developed to an exquisitely high degree. This is Vishvarupa, a representation of Vishnu as revealed by Krishna to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. Vishvarupa has innumerable forms, eyes, faces, mouths, and arms, and contains all creatures, peaceful and wrathful. Unable to bear the sight or the scale of Vishvarupa, Arjuna begs Krishna to return to his four-armed form. The convention of portraying Hindu deities with many heads, arms, and eyes, as is the name of Dora Smith-Srinivasan's study on the subject, as with the story of Vishvarupa, serves to convey a metaphysical reality inhabited by the god, reminding us of the infinite potentiality inherent in every form, every moment of our endlessly self-generating creation. Likewise, the destructive elements of deities like Kali communicate the self-devouring aspect of creation, reabsorbing everything that is created in time. The multiple forms track metaphysical possibilities behind the world of forms, revealing the forces that work in and through everything we experience. One particularly fascinating figure in Hindu art for me is Anantashesha, the infinitely headed serpent on which Vishnu reposes during the endless, timeless period between the creation of universes. To me, the infinitely headed serpent is one of those things you can just look at and understand that what it represents is the underlying basis for everything. It seems to contain all of the infinite potentialities of forms, such as tree roots, river systems, and sparks like the one photographed here. The image of a multi-headed serpent also exists in countless world mythologies. From Mesoamerica to Greece, where the Lernaean Hydra is literally a fractaling serpent. If you cut off one of its heads, two more grow in its place. The serpent is a nearly universal, chthonic symbol of the underworld, the unconscious, the after-death states of eternity, and the slippery, shape-shifting nature of life itself. And it's interesting to note that in Christianity, the many-headed beast, when it appears as a serpent of the depths, or as the seven-headed beast written by the whore of Babylon in the book of Revelation. The serpent is, of course, identified with Satan, or the pagan deities who must be oppressed as the enemy of God. This enmity with the serpent predates Christianity. It is also present in Greek mythology, where Hercules' second labor involves slaying the Hydra. This is an amazing 20th century painting by John Singer Sargent that basically sums up some pretty core tenets of Western civilization. We have a golden man trying to bludgeon the serpent of infinity. I love looking at this image side by side with images of Krishna, who comes into conflict also with a many-headed serpent named Kaliya, but is able to subdue the serpent by dancing on it. In Christian art, meditative, form constancy forms often occur in depictions of heaven and hell, or the Last Judgment. This is the Last Judgment by Fra Angelico and William Blake. The timeless time at the end of time, which has unfortunately been all too often interpreted literally, rather than as a profound spiritual paradigm it could be. Likewise, there are certain Bible stories, which are apparently descriptions of visions of the hallucinatory spirit realm that have inspired some of the strangest, most fascinating images in the history of Christian art. One is the story of Ezekiel's vision of a wheel in a wheel and four winged beasts covered in eyes all around, beings whose physical structure resemble the classic angels known within Judaism as seraphim. The wings of seraphim seem to connote beings that exist in a metaphysical reality related to the multiplicity convention in Hindu art. This is an interesting French Gothic manuscript illumination of the coronation of the Virgin Mary. Mary is being taken into heaven while angels of the spirit realm, apparently the same color and substance of the infinite blue of the sky, play music, while more angels continuously crown the enthroned Christ. The angels upon angels above Christ's head resemble the recursive tracers of feedback loops, creating a sense that the scene we are witnessing is not a one-time event, but an eternal, cosmic mechanism continually at play. The angels behind Mary bear wings that look like peacock wings, a common convention within Northern Renaissance painting, as in this painting of the Archangel Gabriel in a detail of the Ghent altarpiece by Van Eyck, or the Archangel Michael in Van der Weyden's Last Judgment, shown here in the context of a painting in the panel of an altarpiece. The similarity to the eye-covered wings of Ezekiel's creatures is striking. Indeed, the idea that beings of the heavenly realm should be filled with eyes all around, as in this illustration from the Book of Revelation by William Blake, is one of the most fascinating rabbit holes I've ever had the pleasure of going down. In Greek mythology, the giant Argus, whose name means he who sees everything, had a body covered with 100 eyes. He was decapitated by the god Hermes, and the goddess Hera set his eyes into the tail of the peacock. Indeed, if any creature in the animal kingdom looks like God forgot to put away his secret templates, it's the peacock, whose Fibonacci spiral net of eyes is a literal physical expression of Kluver's form constants. An aside, just for a moment, this is E8, a 248-dimensional symmetrical object that some actual physicists and mathematicians believe might have some clues as to the structure of our physical reality. I don't know shit about high-level mathematics. But based on this picture, my gut instinct is to believe they might be onto something. In alchemy, the cauda pavonis, or tail of the peacock, is used to refer to a stage of great work that occasions a change in the subjective experience of the alchemist, allowing all of reality to become as a geometric, multidimensional field of eyes all around. This perceptual concept will be familiar to anyone who has borne witness to visions like those painted by artists like Alex Gray. There is a similar metaphysical reality described in the Attvamsaka Sutra of Mahayana Buddhism. However, instead of eyes, the infinitely reflective surfaces are described as Indra's pearls, and the structure they form is Indra's net. This is from the sutra. In the glistening surface of each pearl are reflected all the other pearls. In each reflection, again, are reflected all the infinitely many other pearls, so that by this process, reflections of reflections continue without end. So perhaps the reason we perceive the eyes in the eyes all around is because here in the West, with our legacy of monotheism, we are in the practice of seeing our own eyes reflecting back at us whenever we endeavor to look at the gods, therefore framing our experience of the divine presence in a slightly more narcissistic fashion. Of course, whenever a human being has a transcendent subjective experience, interprets it, and then attempts to communicate it to others by means of images or language or anything, there's always a certain corrupting element of self to the representation. In Islam, one response to the inherent imperfection of representation is the often evoked, often misunderstood taboo against depicting the prophet in images. Opposing representation of deities or other figures or objects is called aniconism. It's not unique to Islam. Examples may be noted in many cultures throughout history, from the convention against representing the highest god among many African tribal religions to the Byzantine iconoclasm of the 8th and 9th century. The effect of aniconism on the art of Islam, however, has resulted in an intensely sophisticated tradition of, instead of representing figures, representing mathematical geometric forms that are among the world's most rigorous, contemplative, and insightful examples of religious art. But despite the taboo against representation, in some sects of Islam, there's also a rich pictorial history that finds ways around the taboo, often by representing the prophet in a veil or with his face presented in outline only. One particularly evocative subject in Islamic painting is the Isra and Miraj, Muhammad's midnight ascent into heaven on Al-Buraq, his mythological steed, who is often portrayed, we should not be surprised, with a peacock's tail. In the early 20th century, when Augustin Lesage was attending spiritualist meetings and Kandinsky was exploring his synesthesia, a number of occult fraternal organizations were popping up all over Europe, fostering and responding to a growing interest in re-evaluating the symbolic vocabularies that had been oppressed by the history of the church and all but ignored by the new secular culture that had emerged from the Enlightenment. A key influence on the art of Kandinsky was the writings of Madame Blavatsky and the teachings of Theosophy, a system of esoteric techniques for exploring the nature of humanity and the divine. Some of the teachings of Theosophy are that understanding of the divine comes through the study of nature. Nature is alive, a living entity that will and does surge and evolve through its expanding self, replete with dynamic flows of energy and light. Everything in nature can be read as a sign from the creative forces of the universe. The microcosm and macrocosm interplay in the form of synchronicity, which can also be read as signs from nature. As an instructor at the Bauhaus, Kandinsky developed a philosophy of the artist as spiritual agent. He believed that the artist had a moral obligation to be an agent of spiritual awareness and transformation, and considered art for art's sake, that populated so many of the museums of Europe at the time, to be a squandering of artistic potential. William Blake once said that any human being that chooses not to be an artist is not living up to his full human potential. In Kandinsky's view, an artist who does not work in the service of the spiritual is not living up to his artistic potential. Whereas the traditional methods of art instruction in Europe had, since the Renaissance, focused on the accurate representation of the outside world, Kandinsky's students were encouraged to develop their inward eye, investigating the visual language of their own consciousness through painting. Artistically speaking, Kandinsky felt more of an affinity for the so-called primitive artists than for the classical masters of representation. Kandinsky's enthusiasm for primitive or untrained outsider artists was shared by his younger French contemporary, the painter and sculptor Jean Dubuffet. Inspired by a 1922 book by the psychiatrist Hans Prinzhorn, Artistry of the Mentally Ill, Dubuffet deliberately sought out the work of such artists working in his own time, whose works he called art brut, or raw art. Augustin Lesage is one of the painters he collected, as was Adolf Wolfli, a Swiss asylum inmate who devoted his life to the production of large-scale watercolor drawings that seemed, according to his psychiatrist and biographer, Walter Morgenthaler, to have a calming, therapeutic effect on his otherwise violent, aggressive personality. Bands of color and idiosyncratic musical notation join with a lexicon of transformational characters, giving Wolfli a formal vocabulary with which to work out some of the cosmic battles at play in his troubled soul in the interaction of his endlessly inventive forms. The growing fascination with primitive art in the early 20th century seems to point to a cultural crisis in Europe. Indeed, the outbreak of World War I in 1914 is a sure sign of that crisis coming to a head. For artists who were born in the last few decades of the 19th century, who witnessed the technological industrial revolution in their childhood, and the rise of airplanes and motor cars, and finally, the crowning achievement, industrial scale warfare, the coming of the modern era must have seemed, for lack of a better word, utterly insane. And also, a rational progression of events that had been in motion since the Enlightenment. The outbreak of World War I forced Kandinsky to return home to Moscow, and then the suppression of artists in communist Russia brought him back to Germany shortly after the war. Kandinsky experienced the war as a citizen on both sides and integrated the conflict, as well as his desire to transcend that conflict, into the most basic levels of his artistic philosophy. If the spiritual journey is, as Mircea Eliade, Joseph Campbell, and others have told us, nearly universally dependent on a shamanic trip through the underworld, then the early 20th century represents a descent into hell that could, for the first time, be felt by millions of people all over the world, all at once. Few Few biographies in the history of 20th century Europe dovetail as closely with the idea of World War I as a collective journey through the underworld as that of Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and one-time protege of Sigmund Freud. By coincidence, or was it a synchronicity, at roughly the precise moment when Augustin Lesage was doing his best spirit-guided painting, the spirits want the paper to be on the floor. They want me to memorize it. And Kandinsky was formalizing his ideas on the spiritual in art. Jung was devoting himself to the creation of a handmade book he called Liber Novus, the New Book, which is more commonly referred to as the Red Book. The project began as a personal diary chronicling a period of deep, almost psychotic depression, triggered in part by Jung's falling out with Freud in 1913. Their friendship had unraveled because Jung increasingly began to question Freud's preoccupation with the unconscious as a reservoir of repressed desires, almost always of a sexual nature. Jung came to understand Freud's view of the unconscious to be somewhat crudely limited and dualistic. Rather than tethering his idea of the unconscious to the specific drives or desires of an individual, Jung was beginning to think of the unconscious mind in layers, with certain processes originating in a species-wide, apparently evolutionarily derived collective unconscious. From the time Jung stopped working on it in 1930 until its first publication in 2009, the Red Book had been seen by fewer than a dozen people. His heirs kept it private for nearly 5 decades after his death, due to its strange, revealing content. Today, only 5 years have passed since its first publication, and its impact is only beginning to be felt. However, one thing is now crystal clear. For Jung, the unconscious is no hypothetical intellectual construct. It's a force he directly felt and observed during the period documented by the Red Book. In the first section, The Way of What Is to Come, Jung comes to understand his ego as a projection of the spirit of the time, the zeitgeist of the era in which he lived. But the Red Book was inspired by another spirit, which Jung calls the spirit of the depths. This spirit tells Jung that it has existed from time immemorial and possesses power far greater than the spirit of this time. This spirit is the luminous darkness of eternity, the void that gives rise to form, the hollow chasm that resonates infinitely in a gaping, bloody laugh. Like Lesage, Jung had no formal training as an artist or painter. However, it was the command of the spirit of the depths that Jung also take up the brush and attempt to render the visions he was seeing. Through a process he called active imagination, he encountered a series of visions led by the prophet Elijah and his daughter, the anima figure, Salome, who acted as his spirit guides, not unlike Dante's Virgil and Beatrice. The book takes the form of an illuminated manuscript, punctuated by paintings, some of which appear to unfold in a filmic sequence that connotes the unfolding of an image over time. Of this period in his life, Jung later wrote, "The years when I pursued the inner images were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. It began at that time, and the later details hardly matter anymore. My entire life consisted of elaborating on what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me. That was the stuff and material for more than only one life. Everything later was merely the outer classification, scientific elaboration, and the integration into life. But the numinous beginning, which contained everything, was then. It was during this period that I gained the crucial insight that there are things in the psyche which I did not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. Much of Jung's dense, sometimes inscrutable later work is made much more lucid when placed in the context of the Red Book. Although he enjoyed an interest in religious mythologies and iconography prior to 1913, the direct experience of visions for which he previously had no context led him on a lifelong journey to dig deeper in the hopes of uncovering some insight into his inner images. In the iconography of alchemy, Jung found a mysterious occult vocabulary that seemed to connect Christian Europe to older, more mystical strains of spiritual experience, many of which had been actively suppressed by the Church. The process of alchemical transformation would eventually become the context in which Jung labored, understanding alchemy as the spiritual and psychological process of individuation, the process by which a self acquires its selfness. In the iconography of Hinduism and Buddhism, Jung came to develop an enthusiasm for the mandala, a form of yantra, or geometric composition used in certain meditative rituals in order to create an experiential experience, reality of the deity as a lived experience. Indeed, many of the images that seem most pervasive in Jung's personal cosmology are familiar. The multidimensional, infinitely reflective orb we've called Eyes All Around or Ender's Web is alluded to in many of the images. Also, the serpent. Jung's soul speaks to him in the form of a serpent, that sinuous line of life. The monster Atma Victu, the breath of life, the creative impulse, also appears in the form of a serpent-like dragon with multiple arms extending in all dimensions. This image is one of my favorite in the whole Red Book because it's caught somewhere between the viciously dominant Hercules and the ingenious Krishna. Here our hero battles his multidimensional monster of the unconscious only to find himself scaling an increasingly enormous shape made of its blood. It also reminds me of this image from the 15th century alchemical treatise Aurora Consurgens and alludes to esoteric interpretations of the image. Like the alchemists he found so inspiring, some of Jung's most important insights seem to come in the form of revisiting unconscious symbols such as the serpent that have been historically interpreted as dark or evil by Christianity, finding new ways to integrate those symbols into a holistic cosmology of self. Another image that appears to Jung is that of a god emerging from an egg. This particular illumination recalls the visions of Hildegard von Bingen, the 12th century mystic, abbotess, and polymath, who you'll be hearing more about in a couple weeks, who experienced cosmic visions and composed manuscripts, music, and supervised the production of illuminated paintings. The cosmic egg is similar to the mandorla shape that often appears around deities, as in representations of the resurrected Christ. Here he is descending into hell. To me, that's the most important thing in the entire Bible, but that's all it says about it. We don't find out what he did there. I have a guess. Perhaps even more tellingly, the image of the Virgin enthroned. The mandorla is also known as the vesica piscis, literally bladder of the fish in Latin. It's a shape formed by overlapping two circles with the same radius in such a way that the center of each circle is a point on the circumference of another. The shape is ubiquitous in Christian iconography, from the royal portal at Xhurch to the Jesus fish that graces countless SUV bumpers and faith-duck co-eds across Middle America. Its use as a Christian symbol is traced to such parables as the miraculous draught of fish, a story that some students of the Gospels believe to be a thinly veiled Pythagorean allegory. The symbol, foundational to the mathematics and philosophy of Pythagoras, in fact predates ancient Greece. A hieroglyph representing the horizontal vesica Pisces was used by the Egyptians to represent the concept mouth, creative word, and the supreme being Ra, all in one, which is related, possibly, to the metaphysical notion related in the Gospel of John. In the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In Hinduism, it's also used to represent the yoni, the feminine divine passage through which the multiplicity of forms comes into being. Even in Christian images, the formal representation to the female genitalia is obvious, as in this medieval illumination of Christ's wounds. Indeed, if there's any topic that's worthy of its own offshoot lecture, it's the relationship between gender, sexuality, and the history of their representation in religious art. While the mechanical aspects of womanhood have often been worshipped at various times, and in fact comprise many of the earliest artifacts on the planet, until very recently, the field of drawing God has been overwhelmingly dominated by men for many centuries, and the result is that the visual perspectives of the spiritual worlds we have inherited are masculine in almost every conceivable way. Perhaps ironically, the female anatomy is often an elephant in the room when it comes to drawing God within the context of the patriarchal religious traditions. As far as human beings are concerned, the vagina is probably the most literal symbol of creation that we've ever seen. After all, it's how we all arrived here, Caesareans like myself notwithstanding. Jung's solution to the over-masculinization of his own ego was the introduction of the anima, the feminine aspect of self, which must be acknowledged and integrated in the alchemical process of individuation. For my part, I appreciate the work of some 20th century feminist artists who concern themselves with spirituality, trance states, and delivering new visual symbols with a feminine perspective. One of my favorite artists from this era is Carolee Schneemann. Although Schneemann is a familiar name in many feminist body art circles for the piece Interior Scroll, a performance in which she read aloud from a scroll retrieved from her vagina. She began her career as an expressionistic painter whose work shows the influence of Kandinsky-like forces. As Schneemann's work developed, she began extending her practice of painting into performance, photography, and film, as in this piece, within and beyond her limits, in which the artist suspended herself and fasted in order to achieve trance states while she drew. Some of my favorite works by Schneemann are from a series of photographs called I, Body, from 1963. Like Jung, the artist began using visual art as a method for pictorially investigating the psyche, producing images whose meanings she could only discover later. When she made this image, she claimed she was unaware of goddess religions and serpent symbolism, but had simply liked the quality of the serpentine line of these fake snakes. A musician and voice teacher friend in Seattle told me a really fascinating anecdote about this image. She was working with a female Siberian shaman who conducts healing workshops using her voice, drum, movements, and other techniques for producing sounds in the dark. My friend had a copy of a catalog of Schneemann's work from the Henry Art Gallery with this image on the cover sitting in her house. And the shaman saw the image and said, "Oh, Buchu." She immediately connected the image to something from her own tradition. I've actually had the opportunity to ask Schneemann about this association, and it turns out it was nothing intentional at the time. Rather, a convergence of the methods disparate artists with vastly different cultural experiences choose to illustrate their experience. When I titled this lecture, How to Draw God from Direct Observation, I had a vague idea of the kind of images I wanted to include, but I didn't know how I was going to string them together into a narrative, or what kind of point I wanted to make, or if I even should be making a point. When I was editing images and deciding what stories to tell in the span of this hour, I realized quickly that the most difficult task would be narrowing down the massive universe of information that might be relevant to this topic. It could easily be expanded into a semester-long class or maybe a book. But having titled the lecture with How To, I feel at least obligated to leave you with some words of encouragement for your own practice, whatever it may be. It's 2014. I'm tired of conversations that begin with the assumption that God does not exist, just as I am tired of the conversations that begin with the assumption that God is a heavenly Father. Jesus was a literal historical person who really did the things in the Bible as interpreted by 21st century megachurch pastors. I'm a fan of Voltaire's sentiment. If God did not exist, it would be necessary for us to invent him. But I'm equally a fan of Lao Tzu, who tells us in the Tao Te Ching, the way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. The Tao, or the Absolute, or what some call God for lack of a better word, is a concept that is fundamentally impossible to put into words. And yet we try all the time in our poetry. And I believe that Lao Tzu comes close to succeeding when he calls the Tao mystery upon mystery, gateway of the manifold secrets. Throughout most of human history in almost every corner of the world, God was not a he or even a single entity. There were, and still are, of course, pantheons, which embody every living aspect of nature, including the parts of nature that we're accustomed to perceiving as non-living. I'm not too concerned with the question of whether these gods live in nature or in our nervous system. Either way, everything we know about nature arises in our subjective experience. We're made out of nature, so we're made out of God. Thus, the path to creating images that resonate with our experience of the divine always begins with a movement inward. Our challenge is not so much to make contact with the gods, but to learn how to draw aside the veil that separates us from them in our experience. We may meditate. We may hallucinate. We may read books or find ourselves engaged in a spiritual tradition, whatever our path. I personally find it humbling and infinitely inspiring to flood myself from time to time with all the holy images of all the mystics who have ever gone before us, because these kinds of images resonate with something deep inside us, because ultimately they're made of the kind of math we're made of. Go forth and draw God if you are so inclined. That's it.
No Q&A?
I mean, okay. I don't know everything I know I just said, but maybe. Does anyone have any questions for me specifically? As a human being, not about my expertise in nothing. Hey. Hello.
Well, first I want to say thank you. I'm very inspired as both an artist and a performer who's interested in these things. But just it's a great synthesis of all of this stuff. And I wonder if it occurred to me when you were earlier on when it was the sort of the geometric visionary art forms that just sort of erupting out of certain people. And it reminds me a lot of, and I wonder if you have any thought about this, just the spontaneous doodles that come to anybody, like long phone, because I've noticed that in other people doing them in me, that there's a character to them that is very much
Form
like
constants.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't even really read too much about doodles, but I've done them, and I've probably done some of those doodles that look like brains or spaghetti or little,
Or like a whole page covered with little circles.
Totally. Well, I think it's interesting. I read some article about Jung and how he, it's like obviously he wasn't trained as an artist, but he's had visual references, and he traveled and saw like Byzantine mosaics, and he saw he had some pamphlets in his study of painting exhibitions he'd been to. So they were able to go, okay, he knew about this and this, maybe he didn't know about this. I think there's always a sort of interplay between what we're made out of and then what we take in, and that sort of what you're exposed to is sort of the signal you put into the signal chain of the transmission. You have some input as well as whatever the machinery is that's driving the perception. So, I think probably doodles arise anything like a combination of what we take in and also what we're processing through. Interesting idea to look into more. Anybody else have any? Yeah.
How is the peacock used in Christianity?
In Christianity, well, the wings of angels are always peacocks, especially and also in like Islamic manuscripts too. Like you should the archangels always have rainbow wings that have eyes sort of radiating outward, and like the better the artist is, the more they look sort of like a Fibonacci sequence, or have that sort of fractal proportion to them, the self similarity. You just see them over and over again in like manuscript paintings. I mean, the one painting I showed was from France from the 15th century, like 1400s. But it's just something that probably somebody started doing it, and other people caught on, and so it's always hard with a convention like that to know who's the visionary seeing the thing, and then what's the sort of it's just like, this is the way we always paint the angels, you know.
I was wondering if it was in the Bible itself.
Is it in the Bible?
Yeah, I just don't know.
I mean, definitely the four creatures that are in the vision of Ezekiel are described as having wings with eyes all around. And there's also the seraphim that I showed an image of. There's sort of textual references within like mystical and esoteric Judaism that talk about seraphim as having that structure of multidimensional unfolding and eyes on every surface. But it's the translating the text into image that sometimes takes a leap of somebody's ingenuity, because maybe it would have been easier if he had drawn a picture when he wrote it down. The first person who saw it. Ezekiel should have had a camera.
That was a Flannery O'Connor thing. She's a Catholic writer, and she always says characters have visions. In the sense they're like peacocks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're beautiful. If you've never even looked into alchemy at all, you can just think that peacocks are the coolest thing, because they have structural color. They don't have pigment in their feathers. They just reflect the light that they reflect. So, it's really it's a thing to behold. So it makes sense that something that's just like incredibly opulent and resplendent would represent certain things about heaven. The thing about actually, I didn't put the slide in my stuff, but go home and look up the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, which is the bottom quarter panel of Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece. And it's got a fountain, not unlike this one. I think it's an octagon though, in the bottom center, and it's just this like geometric reality made out of figures and a lawn and the lamb and his crown and the eyes and the horns and everything. And it's very subtle, but there's this thing happening in that painting. It also happens in a lot of paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, and it's hard to even show those aspects of the paintings because you kind of have to see them in person, on mushrooms, or like in a sufficiently meditative headspace to see the parts of the paintings that kind of pop out like a magic eye. There's definitely a thing, and I started digging into reading everything I could about the Ghent altarpiece after like sort of glancing at it in a meditative state and going, what the what? And there's that painting is in Ghent, Belgium, in a church where you can go see it. It's pretty small, but there's a lot of speculation as to why the super trippy pictures among like Northern Renaissance painters. There's speculation that the alchemy they were involved in was like making drugs, or like meditation practices that enable them to see, because clearly these like the mathematical reality is there. It's your brain doesn't always grasp it. It's like something about between the pattern and your pattern recognition software, and you experience sort of a shift in scale where like it's like, oh, this thing comes together for me in this concert of transcendence, and it's not always there. And what's interesting is in the painting, like you can see like everybody's sort of worshiping like nothing. There's an empty hole. It's like it's a fountain. God, I wish I had this painting to point to. But everybody's just kind of praying, and you're like, what's going on? And then when the thing appears to you, it's just like, it's hidden in plain sight, you know? And that's kind of, God is sort of this thing that emerges in this other dimension of seeing the painting. And, you know, the really remarkable thing about that painting is, like, it was done by one guy who died and his brother finished it, so they were both, like, on the wavelength, which is, it's amazing enough for one person to be on that wavelength. But yeah, there's also just a lot of, like optics at the time, you know, and geometry and, like, the vanishing point, and it's like the Renaissance, and everybody got very, very highly developed and skilled at representation. So when they chose to represent higher level mathematical realities and do weird optic tricks like that, the techniques were just, like, exquisite to do so. And so I think, like, there's a certain kind of, there's a handful of, like, Northern Renaissance paintings that, like, sort of are the really ecstatic, high Christian art, and its relationship to the stories as popularly interpreted in Christianity is kind of, it's almost like beside Christianity, or like Gnostic, the way that the paintings come to life when they do, which, I don't know, it's pretty cool. But yeah, check it out. Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. Yo, Matt.
I'm curious if in your recent studies, or just in general, you've encountered anyone writing specifically about or studying, like, the origins of religious stories, religious offshoots, cults, and, like, the art kind of surrounding the actual, like, the creation of, like, a new religious offshoot, or, you know, just religious iconography, religious sacred environments. You know, do you know if there's anyone, like, because people like to put religion in a category,
Right.
and then religious iconographic art in a category, but then there's the art world, you know?
Right. And something that is weird is, like, there's a couple things that are weird with that, which one is that those categories only exist because we're, like, you know, Westerners with this sort of colonial imperialist history of looking at things and going, this isn't that, you know? You know, there are people practicing faiths that wouldn't call it that at all. You know, like, no, these are the guys that we talk to in the forest, like, this is what we do, like, this is a real thing. And the level of, like, perception of reality is the line's in a different place, you know? So I think that, you know, it's merely by convenience that we have those categories, some of them, you know? Like, I didn't include a ton of indigenous art forms because I feel like there's, like, 25 lectures that could be had on this topic. But, I mean, I was looking at, like, Navajo sand paintings where the people making them they don't feel like they're making them or they're composing them. It's like the painting is a spirit, and the spirit is alive, and it does what it wants to do. And, like, your job is to just do it and also, like, be respectful of it and don't let anybody take pictures or, like, defile the space. So there's all kinds of ways that people have experienced these sort of perceptual realities that are outside of normal perception. And I think, like, that's where a lot of those ideas begin, you know, with so-and-so's revelation. But I also think that, like, ever since the very first, like, people who decided to believe in anything, there hasn't been an origin of anything new so much as, like, the constant evolution of everything. Which is why the, like, many-headed serpents are so fascinating to me, because it's like if you try to, like, figure out the origin of one head, it's like there's a whole 100 more heads where that came from. You know, it's like the structure is, like, bigger than, the scale is bigger than the thing you're looking at, you know? And the history of Christianity, like, you look at the beginnings of it, you know, like, did Jesus really live? Well, I don't know, everything he says, like, Hillel said, or, like, you know, the Stoics or some other philosophers said. And there's, like, 25 other people who've already been, you know, died and resurrected in this, like, 12-block radius, you know? I'm just kidding, but, you know, there's a lot. But so everything that he does is kind of, you know, something that other gods were already doing. It's like the Mighty Boosh where somebody's copying me. No, it's not. And so by the time it gets to Christianity, there's a lot of books. There's also a political motivation to have the Council of Nicaea and make a Bible. So you're putting together things and starting a story, but you're putting it together from a lot of grades that extend back in time before the moment where the thing's being conceived. You know what I mean?
Definitely. And yeah, so like Jesus as an example, maybe the most epic performance artist of all time. I guess that's kind of what I was getting at. Is like, it's interesting people don't draw that connection between like religious figures
Totally.
and artists.
There's this really fascinating book called The Death and Resurrection Show by this guy Rogan Taylor, and he's never written another book to my knowledge. It just showed up out of nowhere, Deus Ex Machina, in the early 80s. He's British, and it's just about like it's about shamanism and performance art and rock and roll, and like the history of basically the idea is that when shamans would, they used to do the thing, and you have like a shaman of the tribe, but then when people start to get closer together, or they're migrating and they're moving, then this group of people comes into contact with these group of people, and then you have shamans kind of duking it out for territory, and that like the showmanship and the ability to not just like navigate the spirit world, but to present that information in a way that was compelling and won converts was a really adaptive thing. And so show business, he like basically, traces the circus and traveling minstrel shows and like all of it, like everything to basically the first performers who would have been, enacting the mysteries, and like the official beginning of drama and the language we use for drama is around Greek festivals that do the same thing. Dionysus is a trip through the underworld, and Jesus is, kind of situated on top of the mysteries. But drama was like, as we know it, was born in the mysteries. That book also, he talks about Harry Houdini a lot, who's apparently amazing. He was doing real magic, and people had their minds blown by it. And because he was really doing it, he was really locked up and getting himself out of these things. It's just like, it's insane. He just kept doing increasingly ballsy tricks and was just compelled to do it. And, he makes a case that he's like he doesn't know that he's acting in this tradition because it's like been his birthright. Our school robbed me of my shamanic birthright. but no, he didn't go to our school. But you know what I mean? Like the Enlightenment.
His father's a rabbi.
Was it? Yeah, it was. His mother was also. His father died, and he was really attached to his mother too for a long time. And his mother died, and it finally made him insane. Like he basically got in a fight to the death with somebody just over. He just decided to fight. But yeah, was his father a rabbi?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I just remember reading a lot about his mother. I think maybe his father must have died, and he was mostly like a mama's boy, according to this book. I don't know. Also, it's just a really weird book by one guy.
What was that?
Super interesting. Rogan Taylor. It's weird too. He talks about rock and roll. Half the time he's just talking about Jimi Hendrix and feedback wrangling being like shamanism, guitar shamanism. Which is like totally what we were just talking about. It's the same stuff. It's just sound. So, I believe it. Jimi Hendrix was too pure for this world. Spirits took him back. He barely noticed. The furniture is different here. But yeah, there's definitely, I don't know, it was funny, I was talking to my friend Randall, came over today while I was working on this, he's like, the more I read about religion, the more I've just like decided everything is just echoes of shamanism. I'm like, that's probably true, yeah, I think so. It's like everything's echoes from what people have been doing as long as we've been people, and before that, are there animal shamans? Probably. We don't really understand animals.